To get a fully rounded view of the First Crusade, it's important to read sources from different angles, different peoples who were involved in some way. Some of this involvement was not voluntary. This is especially true for the Jews, who ended up being killed in large numbers during the First Crusade, and also in many cases for the Muslims, right, who were attacked in their lands. And so I want to spend this video taking a look at a few sources from those who were not Western Latin Christians. We'll start with a Jewish source, then look at a Muslim source, and finish up with a Byzantine source, which is from a Christian viewpoint, but it's the Greek Eastern Christians who were part of the Byzantine Empire at the time. During the First Crusade, or in this whole period, there were communities of Jews living mostly along rivers and major trade routes in northern Europe. A few thousand Jews had even crossed the English Channel with William the Conqueror to set up the first Jewish communities in England. The largest of these communities in northern and western Europe, at least outside of Spain and Italy, where there were probably significantly larger communities, were along the rivers in Germany, the Rhine River, the Main River, and the Danube River. The largest of these communities was probably the community of Mainz, which was a kind of capital almost of the German Empire in the High Middle Ages. It's now a rather middling-sized city in Germany. But in Middle Ages, this was one of the most important. And so this chronicle, which is attributed to a guy named Solomon Bar Simpson, or Bar Samson, depending on how that's transliterated, was written perhaps 20, 30, 40 years after these events. It was written in Hebrew. It was written by a Jewish author. And it's important to remember in that case that this author was a survivor of these events. He was not killed, as many of his contemporary Jews were. One of the questions you might ask is, if the Crusades were kind of headed to the Holy Land and were all about regaining the territory there, why would they strike out against Jews? Well, the source itself tries to capture the Christian thinking in this regard. And it does it from a very Jewish perspective. Like the words here are those, the Jews, the words here describe Christianity as the Jews would describe them, even though, technically they're describing what the Christians were saying, but we still get the gist of it. According to this source, again, this is a characterization, right? A Jewish characterization of what the Christians were saying. Look now, we are going a long way to seek out the profane shrine. The profane shrine would be a reference to the holy sites of Christianity, right? The tomb of Jesus in particular, the Holy Sepulchre. And profane in the sense that Jews found it profane, right? They did not believe Jesus was the Messiah and all of that. The Christians obviously would not have described it this way. Anyway. We are going a long way to seek out the profane shrine and to avenge ourselves on the Ishmaelites. Ishmaelites is another reference to the Muslims. When here in our very midst are the Jews, they whose forefathers murdered and crucified him, meaning Jesus, for no reason. Let us first avenge ourselves on them and exterminate them from among our nations, so the name of Israel will no longer be remembered, or let them adopt our faith and acknowledge the offspring of promiscuity. Again, the offspring of promiscuity is a pejorative reference to Jesus. From the Jewish angle, there were some texts that circulated among Jewish communities in the Middle Ages suggested that the Virgin Mary was actually a prostitute and that Jesus was born of a kind of unholy, union outside of the bounds of wedlock and all of that, right? But the idea here is that the Christians are saying, well, the Jews killed Christ. And this was a common charge all through this period that led to the persecution of Jews. It happened during the Crusades. It happened on other occasions as well. And so, that's the justification the Christians had for striking out against the Jews. And this happened after these Crusader armies were gathered together, and as they were traveling through these regions where there were large Jewish communities. They in some cases at least, not all of the Crusaders did this, but some of the Crusader armies, went to the places where the Jews lived and tried to kill them. And then we get a description in this text of, a couple of things. One is the Jews' efforts to protect themselves. And, this involved, first of all, kind of organizing and reaching out to, as it says here, the elders, meaning the Jewish leaders, decided to ransom the community by generously giving of their money and bribing the various princes and deputies and bishops and governors. And so they reached out to the Christian authorities, gave them money, and said, please protect us. And in fact, Jews already had kind of protection arrangements with many of these authorities. And it seems the Christian authorities, in some cases, really tried to follow through on their commitments. And in some cases, they even succeeded. In the ones detailed in this document, they did not. In the city of Mainz specifically, several hundred, possibly several thousand Jews were killed because the bishop was not able... Bishop, who was more or less the ruler of the city, it's actually the archbishop, I should say, was not able to kind of withstand the pressure of the Crusaders. And they even reached out to the German king, who was also called the emperor, and got him to dispatch letters saying, the Jews should not be killed. But there were other leaders, dukes and local counts, and these types who, some of whom were in conflict with the emperor. This shows you how complicated this political map can be, right? You might think he's the emperor and everybody's going to obey him, but that wasn't necessarily the case. And so the Jews were caught in the middle of these intra-Christian rivalries. Rivalries between one Christian authority and another Christian authority, and the Jews were kind of collateral damage from that in that respect. And this was especially true for this guy named Count Emicho, who was the main leader of the Christian army, the Crusader army that ended up attacking the city of Mainz. And it seems, according to this document, that Emicho had designs himself on becoming emperor. At least the source attributes that to him, and there's other evidence that shows that too. And the bishop was on the side of the Jews, or at least he promised the Jews he would try to protect them. He even said, "We shall die with you or remain alive with you." But then when it came down to it, the bishop ended up fleeing the city and abandoning them. Okay, the most culturally evocative part of this source, and it's one that's just incredibly rich, is the accounts of what some of the Jews did, not all of them. Some of them, it seems, were simply killed in the massacre, slaughtered indiscriminately. Some ended up accepting Christian baptism. This was forcible, but they did it to save their lives, or they were kind of herded in some cases into the water and then, pronounced as baptized Christians. But the author spends a great deal of time, and this is only an excerpt from the source. This is not the entire source. The whole thing runs, 70, 80 pages in a typical edition. But the ones he seems to admire the most are the ones who took the added measure of committing suicide. Okay? And there are long descriptions of this, and there are even more descriptions in the full source, right? This is strange and ironic because suicide was considered a sin. It's akin to murder. You're killing yourself. You're taking a life, right? And God does not like that, according to most Judeo-Christian theology. We already talked about Dante, and that he put people who had committed suicide in a particular part of hell where they were turned into trees and all of that, right? And so, Judaism would have agreed with that, but some Jews decided, rather than give in and be forced to be baptized as Christians, or maybe have their children taken away from them and turned into Christians, that they would commit suicide, and in fact that they would kill, as it says down here, right, the women, the mothers, girded their loins with strength and slew their own sons and daughters and then themselves. Many men also mustered their strength and slaughtered their wives and children and infants. The most gentle and tender of women slaughtered the child of her delight. They all arose, man and woman alike, and slew one another. The young maidens, the brides, and the bridegrooms looked out through the windows and cried out in a great voice, "Look and behold, O Lord, what we are doing to sanctify thy great name, in order not to exchange you for a crucified scion who was despised, abominated, and held in contempt in his own generation, a bastard son conceived by a menstruating and wanton mother." That, of course, a description of Jesus and Mary. right? And the author had to reckon with this paradox, right? That these Jews, the Jews who seemed to be most heroic, the ones who absolutely refused to give in to the Christians, were the ones who also committed the sin of, well, murder and suicide, right? And he uses really the main thing theologically that he had at his disposal, which was the stories from the Bible, right? Especially the story of Abraham being commanded to sacrifice his son Isaac. And if you're not familiar with this story, it's from the book of Genesis, chapter 22 specifically of Genesis. Abraham, who waited his entire life to have a son of the covenant from his true wife, Sarah. They finally have this when they're in their old age, and then God says, go sacrifice your son. And, if you know the story, you'll know that, Abraham was willing to do that and is just about to kill Isaac when the angel comes and says, don't slay the boy, and then provides another sacrifice for them. But Abraham had to show God in some way that he was willing to go through with that, right? That he loved God more than he loved this thing that had been his son that had been promised to him. In this case, there was no angel who came in and intervened, and that perhaps is one of the things that troubled this author. It's also likely that this author, as a survivor of this and perhaps a witness, was one who, well, obviously he did not do this. He did not sacrifice himself and his family. It's likely that he accepted baptism. If he had survived, then he almost certainly had to make compromises of his religion. And so he's looking back at the people who didn't and trying to turn them into heroes, even though, at least from a theological standpoint, they were sinners. So there's a lot to think about with this source, right? It's definitely different from the rather heroic account that we saw in Fulcher of Chartres, though occasionally critical account of the Christians, going on crusade and eventually taking Jerusalem. Spent too much time on that, but that source is just very, very rich. See what you can do with it. If you have questions, please feel free to bring them up on the discussion board. I'll try to do these others more briefly. The next source, Ibn al-Athir, was a Muslim, okay, and lived in Damascus specifically, as it says up here. All right. And he composed an account of this. He's actually writing a good deal after the First Crusade happened. You'll see he wasn't even born until 1160. The First Crusade happened in the 1090s, so we're talking 60 to 70 years after the First Crusade. He composed, or he was born at that point, and probably about 100 years after he composed this account. And, the differences in perspective are really what I want you to pay attention to here, right? The Christian sources talk about, that the Holy Land is in Muslim control, and that's what we need to take. Here, Ibn al-Athir sees this as a larger trend, right? That the Franks, meaning the Western Christians, that's again the euphemism for them, had already attacked Muslim territories. They had taken part of Spain back, right? They had conquered the island of Sicily and even were attacking the African coast where Muslims resided and were dominant, okay? And so the attack on what he calls Syria, which is really the Levant region, was just a part of a trend, according to these Muslims, that the Christians were increasingly pushing into what the Muslims would have called the Dar al-Islam, or the land of Islam. And then he goes on to blame the loss in the First Crusade on the divisions between Muslims, or that existed among Muslims. He talks, for instance, about this group called the Fatimids of Egypt, who were the rulers of that territory and were considered heretics by some, and that they were fighting against what are called the Seljukids here, the Seljuk Turks, who were ruling in Mesopotamia and the Levant. And so this territory that the Christians eventually took was being fought over between Muslims, and this division among Muslims was the thing responsible for this. He does celebrate the deeds of some Muslim rulers, especially Yagashian, who was in charge of Jerusalem at the time, And he even says that Yagashian promised to protect the families of the Christians in Antioch, because the Western Christians would have seen them probably as heretics, right? So he's protecting not only Muslims, but all of the people who were inhabitants of this area these Western strange barbarian Christians are trying to take over, right? So again, this is a very different perspective. This is not just like Christian versus Muslim sort of thing. This is the Franks, who were these weird barbarian interlopers, coming into our territory, taking advantage of our infighting, and slaughtering indiscriminately and doing terrible things. So that's more or less the tone of this, right? He does blame certain Muslim rulers like Kerbuka, for instance, who was a ruler of I think of Jerusalem, or no, I guess of Antioch, and the leader of the army there, and he paints him as a kind of coward, or at least as a bad strategist or something. And then he talks about the terrible things that are done by the Christians when they take Jerusalem, that they strip the Dome of the Rock of all of its precious things. And then he concludes by saying it was the discord between the Muslim princes that enabled the Franks to overrun the country. Right? That's the long and short of it. If we had not been divided against each other, then we would not have lost this. The last source is Anna Komnene. This is the daughter of the Byzantine emperor at the time, Alexius Komnenos. And she's a really interesting author, incredibly learned, literate, a great stylist, literary stylist, but also with some eccentricities to her, right? And the main things that I wanted to say about this is she has very different explanations, right, for all the things that are going on. This perspective, even though it's Christian perspective, she does not celebrate the Crusaders. She, if anything, is wary of them. She doesn't like the Muslims either. She describes the Muslims, as was common among Christians, as worshippers of ancient pagan deities. That, of course, was not true. And she attributes all sorts of, deviant activities to them. For this race is under the sway of Dionysus and Eros, right? The gods of wine and of love and sex, okay? Rushes headlong into all kinds of sexual intercourse and is not circumcised either in the flesh or in their passions. Actually, they were circumcised in the flesh. They practice circumcision, okay? It is nothing but a slave, and triply enslaved to the ills wrought by Aphrodite. For this reason, they worship and adore Astarte and Ashtaroth too. These are ancient Mesopotamian and Canaanite gods, and value above all the image of the moon and the golden figure of Hobar in their country, and, so forth and so on, right? So that's her depiction of Muslims. Obviously, just completely erroneous here, but that's what they believed. But she doesn't paint the Franks in very flattering light either, okay? She says, for instance, that they were always agape for money and seemed to disregard the truces readily for any reason that cropped up, so they're faithless, they're greedy. And any person of intelligence, she says, could feel that with the arrival of the Franks, they were witnessing a strange occurrence. Okay, and she really doesn't know exactly what to do with these people, right? She again talks about how they're fond of money. They will, steal anything that's not tacked down, so to speak. She saves special program for certain leaders of these crusaders, especially Bohemund, who she says really had his eye on the Roman Empire, which probably was true, to be honest. She's rather astute in this. Bohemund was the younger brother of the Norman king of southern Italy, and had designs probably on winning the Byzantine Empire for himself. He ended up becoming the Prince of Antioch. She even says that their priests are not the same as our priests, right? They're barbarians. They, don't believe the correct things theologically. Here we see the schism between Latin and Greek Christianity. She does say a great deal about her father's actions, the emperor. And for the most part, she paints him in a very positive, even flattering light. She says he just wanted to avoid civil strife. He was worried about the Crusaders, worried they were just going to take over or to commit a lot of violence. He tried to make them take oaths of loyalty to them, and many of them did because they respected the person of the emperor, but she knew they would be faithless in doing this. And then she justifies his decision not to send his army with them to try to retake the Holy Land. Instead, he, took some soldiers and waited in a city to see what would happen, and then had plans to kind of swoop in if the Crusaders were effective and claim all of that territory is really what happened. That seems to be pretty true to what Alexios actually planned. So again, a very different perspective of this. It would be, I think, a good idea to look at these different sources and compare their perspectives. And, you could devote your analysis paper, if you like, to the Crusades, or to the First Crusade as a phenomenon, and kind of look at the differences between these sources. But you can take these sources in any number of directions.